You picked the wrong man to mess with. Those 7 words spoken quietly in Seat 1. A of Atlantic Airways, Flight 847 would destroy a billion-dollar empire in less than 48 hours. You think you know who you're looking at? Think again. What happened on this flight from Miami to London will change how you see privilege forever. Before we dive in, comment your city below and hit that subscribe button. You're about to witness instant karma at 35,000 feet. In exactly 45 minutes, an entitled woman named Isabella Rodriguez-Whitmore would discover that the man she tried to destroy holds her entire fortune in his hands. This isn't just a story about a flight. This is about the moment when quiet dignity faced loud privilege and the internet watched justice unfold in real time. By the time this plane touched down in London, Isabella's world would be in ruins, her company worthless, and her name would become a cautionary tale told around the world. So buckle up. You're about to see how one woman's racism cost her everything, and how a man who never raised his voice brought down an empire with nothing but the truth. Isabella Rodriguez-Whitmore stepped onto the jet bridge at Miami International like she owned the airport. At 52, she was a woman who wore her wealth like armor. Platinum blonde hair, razor-sharp Hermes scarf tied with mathematical precision, and a Chanel suit that cost more than most people's cars. She clutched her crocodile Birkin bag like it contained state secrets, which in her world of government contracts and political connections it might as well have. Isabella was the widow of tech mogul Marcus Whitmore, the man who built Whitmore Digital Holdings from nothing into a cybersecurity giant worth $2.8 billion. But Marcus had been dead for 3 years, and since then, Isabella had run the company with an iron fist and zero tolerance for anyone who didn't recognize her authority. She lived in a $12 million mansion in Coral Gables, summered in the Hamptons, and had never heard the word no without immediately demanding to speak to someone's supervisor. Today she was flying first class to London, Seat 1K $15,000 round trip, for what she called business meetings, but what everyone knew were shopping trips funded by government cybersecurity contracts. She was a platinum frequent flyer diamond status member and the kind of passenger who made flight attendants draw straws to see who had to serve her. Tyler. She snapped at the nervous gate agent, a young Hispanic man whose hands were already shaking. "Why is my flight delayed? I have a car waiting at Heathrow, and if I miss my appointment because of your incompetence, I will personally ensure you're fired." Tyler Williams, 35, had been working for Atlantic Airways for 8 years. He'd dealt with celebrities, politicians, and entitled billionaires, but Isabella Rodriguez-Whitmore was in a category all her own. She wasn't just rude. She was strategically cruel, the type of person who remembered names just so she could destroy careers later. "Ma'am, we're just finishing pre-boarding for military personnel and passengers needing assistance." Tyler said, his smile tight and practiced. "First-class boarding begins in exactly 2 minutes." "Military personnel," Isabella scoffed, rolling her eyes. "As if they can afford first class. Just get this moving." But across the gate area, sitting quietly in a corner chair, was a man who could have afforded to buy the entire airline if he wanted to. Commander Marcus Thompson, 48, was reading a worn paperback copy of The Art of War, his noise-canceling headphones around his neck, completely unaware that he was about to become the center of a storm that would reshape an industry. Marcus looked like any other passenger. Navy blue hoodie, dark jeans, pristine white sneakers, the kind of outfit you'd see on any college campus or coffee shop. His only luggage was a simple black backpack, and his boarding pass was folded neatly in his book as a bookmark. He had the kind of calm that comes from years of making life-and-death decisions, but to anyone watching, he just looked like a guy trying to get some reading done before a long flight. What Isabella and the rest of the passengers didn't know was that Marcus Thompson was the deputy director of the Defense Intelligence Agency's cybersecurity division. He was flying to London for a classified NATO summit where he would be reviewing the security clearances of every major government contractor, including Whitmore Digital Holdings. In his backpack was a laptop containing enough classified information to topple governments, and in his mind was a photographic memory of every cybersecurity failure, every corner cut, and every contract violation that had crossed his desk in the past 5 years. Marcus had grown up in Detroit, the son of a single mother who cleaned office buildings at night so he could go to school during the day. A full scholarship to Harvard, then MIT for graduate work, then 20 years in military intelligence, climbing from enlisted to officer to the highest levels of government service. He'd briefed presidents, planned operations that never made the news, and spent more time in secure bunkers than most people spend in their own homes. But today he was just a man trying to visit his sister in London and meet his new nephew for the first time. He'd taken his first vacation in 2 years, traded his dress uniform for civilian clothes, and was looking forward to a week where the biggest decision he'd have to make was whether to order fish and chips or a curry. He had no idea that in the next hour his quiet dignity would be tested by the loudest privilege he'd ever encountered. Atlantic Airways Flight 847 was a Boeing 787 Dreamliner, one of those massive birds that could cross an ocean without breaking a sweat. The first-class cabin was an exclusive sanctuary of wealth, only 8 luxury suites each with its own door, lie-flat bed, and entertainment system bigger than most people's televisions. It was the kind of space where CEOs made billion-dollar deals over champagne and movie stars hid from paparazzi behind tinted windows. The July heat in Miami was oppressive, the kind that made the air shimmer like a mirage and turned the tarmac into a furnace. Inside the air-conditioned terminal, passengers wilted under the fluorescent lights, everyone irritable and anxious to get airborne, where the temperature was a crisp minus 60 degrees Fahrenheit. Flight 847 was already running 30 minutes late due to air traffic control delays, which meant everyone was on edge. The gate area buzzed with the familiar tension of travelers watching departure boards and checking their phones, calculating missed connections and rescheduled meetings. Elena Vasquez, the lead flight attendant, was doing her final checks before boarding. At 28, she was one of the youngest to hold her position at Atlantic Airways, but she'd earned it through a combination of Spanish fluency, crisis management skills, and the ability to handle difficult passengers without losing her composure. She'd served everyone from foreign dignitaries to Fortune 500 CEOs, and she prided herself on remembering faces and names. As she reviewed the passenger manifest on her tablet, one name caught her attention. M. Thompson in seat 1, A. There was something familiar about that name, something that tickled the back of her memory like a half-remembered dream. She'd seen it somewhere before, maybe in the news, maybe at one of the veteran appreciation events she volunteered for on weekends. She made a mental note to pay attention when he boarded. In the gate area, other passengers were getting restless. Sophie Martinez, 24, was a travel blogger from Austin who'd managed to score an upgrade to first class using a combination of airline miles and social media influence. She was already live tweeting the delay, building anticipation for her first-class flight experience blog post. Her phone was charged, her ring light was ready, and she had that hungry look of a content creator who smelled a story. Jake Rodriguez, 31, was in seat 2. A tech entrepreneur who'd sold his startup for enough money to fly first class without thinking about it. He was the kind of guy who live-streamed everything, his morning coffee, his workout routine, his thoughts on cryptocurrency, to an audience of 50,000 followers who hung on his every word. His phone was already set up for streaming, and he was just waiting for something interesting to happen. None of them knew that they were about to witness something that would be watched by millions. When first-class boarding finally began, Isabella was first in line. She always was. She elbowed past a young couple and swept down the jet bridge like she was walking a red carpet, her heels clicking against the floor with military precision. The flight attendant at the door greeted her with a smile. "Welcome aboard, Ms. Rodriguez-Whitmore." Isabella didn't acknowledge the greeting. She was already scanning the cabin, mentally cataloging who deserved to be there and who didn't. As she turned left into the first-class sanctuary, she stopped dead in her tracks. Sitting in seat 1A, the best seat in first class, the seat she'd specifically requested but couldn't get because it was already taken, was a black man in a hoodie. Isabella's brain did what Isabella's brain always did when confronted with something that didn't fit her narrow view of the world. It assumed there was a mistake. The man was reading his book completely relaxed, completely comfortable. His legs were stretched out. His seat was already reclined, and there was a glass of water on his armrest like he'd been there for hours. He looked settled, like he belonged. This was wrong. Everything about it was wrong. Isabella marched to her assigned seat 1K directly across the narrow aisle from him. She threw her bag down with enough force to rattle the champagne glasses and remained standing. She stared at him, waiting for him to acknowledge her, waiting for him to realize his mistake and move. Marcus Thompson turned a page of his book. He didn't look up. The silence stretched for 10, 15, 20 seconds. Other passengers were filing in, but Isabella didn't notice them. Her entire world had narrowed to the man in seat 1A and the wrongness of his presence there. "Excuse me," she said finally, her voice cutting through the soft jazz music playing over the cabin speakers. Marcus looked up. He had kind eyes, intelligent and patient, the kind of eyes that had seen terrible things, but hadn't let them make him terrible. He slid his headphones off his neck and placed them on the armrest. "Yes, ma'am. Can I help you with something?" His voice was deep, articulate, and unfailingly polite, but Isabella didn't hear politeness. She heard audacity. "You're in the wrong seat," she said flatly, pointing toward the back of the plane. "Economy is that way." Marcus glanced at his boarding pass, then back at her. A small, confused smile played on his lips. "I believe I'm in the correct seat, ma'am. 1A. "Don't play games with me," Isabella hissed, leaning closer. Her perfume, something expensive and cloying, wafted over him. "I know how this works. You saw an empty seat and thought you could sneak up here before the real passenger arrived. Well, I'm watching you now. Get up." The smile faded from Marcus's face, replaced by something colder. He'd heard this tone before, felt this particular brand of hatred. It was nothing new, but it never got easier. "Ma'am, I have a ticket for this seat. I'm not sneaking anywhere. Show it to me," Isabella demanded, holding out her hand like she had some kind of authority. "I want to see it." "I don't think I need to show you my ticket," Marcus said quietly. "I've already shown it to the gate agent and the flight crew." "Because it's fake." Isabella's voice rose to a shrill pitch that made other passengers look up from their phones. A tech entrepreneur in 2A and a fashion blogger in 2B were both watching, now their eyes wide with disbelief. "You clearly used miles, or you're an employee using a buddy pass. And let me tell you something. Buddy pass riders are the first to get kicked off when paying customers have an issue." "And I have an issue." Marcus closed his book slowly. He took a deep breath, the kind of breath a man takes when he's deciding whether to engage with ignorance or rise above it. "I suggest you take your seat, ma'am. The flight attendants are trying to prepare for departure." "Don't you tell me what to do," Isabella shrieked. "I paid full fare." "Do you know who I am?" "I am Isabella Rodriguez-Whitmore. My company handles cybersecurity for half the government. I will not sit across from some random person in a sweatshirt who thinks he owns the place." Elena, the lead flight attendant, hurried over with a bottle of champagne in her hand, her professional smile already strained. "Ms. Rodriguez-Whitmore, is there a problem?" "Yes, there's a problem." Isabella spun around, her eyes wild with indignation. "This man is in the wrong seat. He's aggressive. He's rude, and he refuses to show me his ticket. I want him removed immediately." Elena looked at the man in 1A. Something clicked in her memory. That face, that calm bearing. She'd seen him before, but where Ms. Rodriguez-Whitmore? Elena said carefully, This gentleman is listed on our manifest. He's in the correct seat. Check again. Isabella slammed her hand against the wall of her suite. Look at him. Look at what he's wearing. Does he look like he paid $15,000 for a ticket? He's probably a drug dealer or using stolen credit cards. And I won't feel safe with him here. The cabin went dead silent. The racism wasn't subtext anymore. It was right there, naked and ugly for everyone to see. Marcus didn't yell. He didn't stand up. He didn't give Isabella the reaction she was clearly trying to provoke. He simply looked at Elena and said, "Could I get a sparkling water with lime, please, and perhaps a towel for the lady? She seems to be overheating." Isabella gasped like she'd been slapped. "You arrogant Elena, get security. Get the captain. I want this man off this plane immediately. I am a Diamond status member and I demand you verify his credentials right now." Elena looked torn. She glanced at Marcus, who gave her a subtle, almost imperceptible nod. It was a nod of permission, the kind of nod that comes from someone who's been through this before and knows exactly how it ends. I'll get the lead supervisor," Elena stammered. "Please, Ms. Rodriguez-Whitmore, take your seat." But Isabella didn't sit. She stood over Marcus like a predator circling wounded prey, her shadow falling across his book. "You picked the wrong woman to mess with," she sneered. "I'm going to have you arrested before we even leave the gate." Marcus reopened his book to the page he'd been reading. "We'll see," he said quietly. He had no idea how right he was. The tension in the first-class cabin was thick enough to cut with a knife. Isabella Rodriguez-Whitmore stood in the aisle like a general surveying a battlefield. Her manicured finger pointed at Marcus Thompson as if he were a war criminal. "I want to see your credit card," she demanded, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd never been told no. "Prove you paid for this seat. Prove you didn't steal someone's identity or use some government welfare program to get up here." Marcus looked up from his book again, his patience wearing thin but his voice still controlled. "Ma'am, I don't need to prove anything to you. I'm a paying passenger, same as anyone else." "Same as me." Isabella laughed a harsh, grating sound. "I don't think so. People like you always try to scam the airline. You probably found that ticket on the ground or printed a fake one at home. Well, I'm on to you." Sophie Martinez, the travel blogger in 2B, had her phone out now. She wasn't even pretending not to film. This was content gold, a real-time meltdown at 30,000 feet. She whispered to her camera, "Guys, you're not going to believe what's happening right now on my flight. Jake Rodriguez in 2A was live streaming on Instagram. His follower count climbing as viewers shared the stream. This is insane," he muttered to his audience. "This lady is having a complete breakdown." Elena returned with Patricia Woods, the chief flight attendant, a stern woman in her 50s who'd seen everything in 30 years of flying. Patricia took one look at the situation. Isabella standing over a seated black passenger, other passengers filming the entire cabin watching, and knew this was about to become a major incident. "What seems to be the issue here?" Patricia asked, her voice carefully neutral. "The issue," Isabella spat, finally taking a step back but keeping her glare fixed on Marcus, "is that Atlantic Airways has lowered its standards to the point of negligence. This man is clearly not supposed to be here, and when I asked him politely to show me his ticket, he became belligerent." "Belligerent?" Patricia raised an eyebrow. She looked at Marcus, who was sitting calmly with a book in his lap, and then back at Isabella, who was red-faced and practically vibrating with rage. "He threatened me," Isabella lied smoothly. "He told me to watch my back when I asked him to verify his seat assignment. I don't feel safe flying with someone who's clearly unstable." Marcus sighed deeply. "I said nothing of the sort. I asked her to take her seat so the crew could prepare for departure." Liar Isabella screamed loud enough that passengers in business class turned to look. "See, he's calling me a liar now. I want his bag searched. Look at that hoodie. He could be hiding anything, weapons, drugs, anything. I refuse to fly until he's vetted by security." Patricia had dealt with difficult passengers before, but this was different. This wasn't just someone having a bad day or too much to drink. This was deliberate, calculated cruelty. Sir Patricia said to Marcus, "I apologize for this disturbance. Did you threaten this passenger?" "No, Patricia." Marcus replied calmly. He used her name even though she hadn't introduced herself. It was on her badge, but he said it with familiarity, like he knew her from somewhere. Isabella caught this immediately. "He knows your name. He's been stalking the crew. This is terrifying. I'm literally shaking. Look at me, I'm shaking." She was indeed shaking, but it was from rage, not fear. "Ma'am, Patricia," said her patience wearing thin, "I cannot remove a passenger based on your speculation. He has a valid boarding pass. He's cleared security, and unless he commits a specific act of aggression, he stays." Isabella's face turned crimson. She reached into her Birkin bag and pulled out her phone, the latest iPhone in a gold case that probably cost more than most people's rent. "Fine," she hissed. "If you won't do your job, I'll call someone who will. My brother-in-law is a TSA director. I have the CEO of this airline on speed dial. I'm going to make some calls, and when I'm done, you'll be fired, she'll be fired." She pointed at Elena, "and this criminal will be in handcuffs." She began tapping furiously at her phone, but Marcus finally turned his body fully toward her. For the first time since this started, his expression hardened. The calm mask slipped, and for just a moment Isabella saw something in his eyes that made her step back. "Ma'am, Marcus," said his voice dropping an octave and taking on an unmistakable tone of command. "I strongly recommend you do not make that call. You're digging a hole you won't be able to climb out of. Are you threatening me again?" Isabella's voice cracked with what she thought was triumph. "Oh, you're scared now. You know I have connections. You know you're a fraud." She put the phone to her ear loud enough for the whole cabin to hear. "Yes, this is Isabella Rodriguez-Whitmore. I need to speak to Director Martinez immediately. It's an emergency at Miami International Gate B12. I have a security breach on the aircraft." She paused, listening, then glared at Marcus. "Yes, a suspicious male passenger. He's clearly not supposed to be here. He's been aggressive with crew and passengers, and I believe he may be intoxicated or on drugs. I want Port Authority here immediately." She hung up and crossed her arms, a smug smile spreading across her face. "They're coming. Federal agents, Port Authority, police, Homeland Security if necessary." "You're done." Patricia looked horrified. She leaned toward Marcus. "Sir, I am so sorry. I can call the captain if you'd like." "No," Marcus said, raising his hand. "Let her play this out. If she wants the police, let them come." He looked directly at Isabella. "But Patricia—" "Yes, sir. Tell Captain Mitchell not to delay departure any longer than necessary, and tell her that Eagle One is having a situation in the cabin." Patricia's eyes went wide as saucers. She actually gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "Eagle One, sir." "Are you—" "Just tell her," Marcus said quietly. Isabella missed this exchange completely. She was too busy texting her friends about how she was single-handedly taking down a terrorist on her flight. She felt powerful, righteous, like she was protecting America itself. She had no idea she'd just called the police on one of the most powerful men in the United States government. 10 minutes passed. The plane should have been pushing back from the gate, but instead it sat there while Isabella Rodriguez-Whitmore basked in what she thought was impending victory. The pilot had announced a brief delay due to a passenger services issue, which sent a groan through the economy cabin. But in first class, the silence was heavy with anticipation. Marcus Thompson sat calmly in his seat, occasionally turning a page of his book. His phone had buzzed twice with encrypted messages, but he'd ignored them. Whatever was happening in Washington or Brussels could wait. Right now he was more interested in watching Isabella dig her own grave. Isabella, meanwhile, was having the time of her life. She'd called 3 more people, her lawyer, her PR firm, and someone she claimed was very high up in Homeland Security. Each conversation was louder than the last, performed for the benefit of everyone in earshot. "Yes, I'm literally trapped on a plane with a dangerous individual," she said into her phone, pacing in the narrow aisle. "The airline is being completely negligent. This is going to be a lawsuit that destroys them." Sophie Martinez was getting it all on video. Her TikTok followers were exploding as she streamed live updates. "Guys, this is absolutely insane. This woman has called like 5 different government agencies because a man is sitting in first class. I can't even..." Jake Rodriguez was doing the same on Instagram Live. His follower count had jumped from 50,000 to 65,000 in the past hour as people shared his stream. "This is the most entitled behavior I've ever seen in my life," he whispered to his phone. "She's literally trying to have this guy arrested for existing while black." Then came the sound everyone had been waiting for: heavy footsteps on the jet bridge. 3 Miami-Dade airport police officers boarded the plane, their presence immediately filling the cabin with tension. They were big men in tactical vests with serious expressions, the kind of officers who dealt with everything from drug smugglers to terrorist threats. "Airport police," the lead officer announced. Who called in the security concern, Isabella practically bounced to her feet. "Over here, officers." "Thank God you're here." She pointed dramatically at Marcus. "That man is the problem. He's been threatening passengers. He's clearly not supposed to be in first class, and I believe he may be armed." The lead officer. Sergeant Miguel Santos looked at Isabella, then at Marcus. Marcus was still reading his book, his posture relaxed, his hands visible on the armrests. He didn't look like a threat. He looked like a professor on his way to a conference. "Ma'am, did you see a weapon?" Sergeant Santos asked. "Well, no, but look at him," Isabella stammered. "He's wearing a hoodie. He could be hiding anything under there. He fits the profile of someone who would cause trouble on a plane." "What profile is that?" "Ma'am," Isabella's mouth opened and closed like a fish. She'd said the quiet part out loud and now realized it. Just check his identification. Run his name through your system. I guarantee he has a criminal record." Sergeant Santos sighed. This was not how he'd wanted to spend his Tuesday afternoon. He turned to Marcus, who finally looked up from his book. "Sir, I'm sorry to bother you. Do you have identification?" "I do," Marcus said calmly. He reached slowly into his back pocket, his movements deliberate and non-threatening. Isabella actually squeaked and ducked behind her seat. "Watch out. He's reaching for something." The officers didn't flinch. They watched as Marcus pulled out a slim leather wallet. But instead of a driver's license, he pulled out a black badge in a leather case and a heavy metallic ID card with a federal seal and a gold chip. He handed them to Sergeant Santos without a word. Santos looked at the ID. He squinted at it, then his eyes widened. He looked at Marcus, then back at the ID, then at Marcus again. His posture straightened from annoyed cop to something approaching attention. "Oh," Santos said quietly. "Oh, wow. I didn't realize. Is he a felon?" Isabella popped up from behind her seat, gleeful. "Is he wanted?" "I knew it." Santos ignored her completely. He handed the ID back to Marcus with both hands almost reverently. "My apologies, sir. We had no idea you were traveling today. Is this passenger bothering you?" Isabella's jaw dropped. "Excuse me. Bothering him, I am the victim here. Why aren't you arresting him?" "What did that ID say, ma'am?" Santos turned to her, his voice hard now. "You need to be quiet. You have just made a false police report about a federal official." "Federal official?" Isabella screeched. "What kind of federal official? He's wearing sneakers, ma'am. I need you to lower your voice and return to your seat immediately." "I will not. I demand to speak to the captain. Get the pilot out here right now." The cockpit door buzzed. It clicked open with an electronic whir. "You called for me?" Captain Sarah Mitchell stepped out of the cockpit, and the entire dynamic of the cabin shifted instantly. She was a woman in her mid-40s with silver hair pulled back in a regulation bun, 4 stripes on her shoulders, and eyes that had seen combat in Iraq and Afghanistan before she'd transitioned to commercial aviation. She looked at the police officers, then at the chaos in her first-class cabin, then at Isabella Rodriguez-Whitmore standing there, red-faced and furious. "I understand there was a code," Eagle One Captain Mitchell said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd commanded military aircraft in war zones. "Yes, ma'am," Marcus said, standing for the first time since the confrontation began. Eagle One requesting permission to handle this situation. Captain Mitchell's face went pale. She looked at Marcus Thompson, really looked at him, and recognition dawned in her eyes. "Deputy Director Thompson," she said quietly, "I didn't know you were traveling with us today." And then, to Isabella's absolute shock and horror, Captain Sarah Mitchell, the ultimate authority on the aircraft, snapped to attention and delivered a crisp, sharp salute to the man in the hoodie. "Welcome aboard, sir. We are honored to have you." The word Deputy Director hung in the air like a bomb waiting to explode. Isabella Rodriguez-Whitmore felt the blood drain from her face so fast she thought she might faint. The word deputy echoed in her ears, but her brain refused to process what she was hearing. Deputy Director. Government. Federal. Salute. Deputy Director of what? She whispered, her voice barely audible. Captain Mitchell kept her eyes on Marcus, her salute still crisp. Deputy Director Thompson is the second-ranking official in the Defense Intelligence Agency. She said, her words carrying across the cabin like a death sentence. He oversees cybersecurity operations for the entire Department of Defense. The silence that followed was deafening. Even the airplane's ambient noise seemed to fade as every person in first class absorbed the magnitude of what had just been revealed. Sophie Martinez's phone nearly slipped from her hands. Her TikTok live stream was being shared across every social media platform in real time. "Oh my God," she whispered to her camera. "Oh my God, you guys. She just tried to have a Pentagon official arrested." Jake Rodriguez was frantically typing on his phone while maintaining his live stream. His follower count had exploded past 100,000 as news outlets began picking up his feed. "This is bigger than viral," he muttered. "This is about to be international news." Marcus Thompson slowly returned Captain Mitchell's salute, then gestured for her to stand at ease. His demeanor hadn't changed. He was still calm, still controlled, but now there was an undeniable gravity to his presence. "Thank you," Captain Marcus said. "I apologize for the disturbance to your flight schedule." "No apology necessary, sir. Should I have these officers escort Ms. Rodriguez-Whitmore off the aircraft?" Isabella's world was crumbling in real time. Deputy Director, Defense Intelligence Agency, Cybersecurity Operations. The words tumbled through her mind like rocks in an avalanche, each one bringing her closer to a terrible realization. Cybersecurity. Her company. Whitmore Digital Holdings. "Wait," she said, her voice cracking. Wait. You're in cybersecurity. For the government." Marcus looked at her for the first time since Captain Mitchell had emerged from the cockpit. His expression was unreadable, but there was something cold in his eyes now, something that made Isabella take an involuntary step backward. "Among other things," he said quietly. What other things? Isabella's voice was getting higher, more desperate. "What exactly do you do?" Marcus glanced at Captain Mitchell, who nodded almost imperceptibly. "I oversee security clearance reviews for all government contractors." Marcus said, each word deliberate and precise. "I evaluate the reliability, trustworthiness, and character of individuals and companies that handle classified information for the United States government." Isabella's knees nearly buckled. Whitmore Digital Holdings held dozens of government contracts worth billions of dollars, contracts that required the highest levels of security clearance. contracts that came up for renewal. When she whispered, "I'm sorry, when do the contracts come up for renewal?" Her voice was barely a whisper now. Marcus tilted his head slightly like he was considering whether to answer. "The Whitmore Digital Holdings contract portfolio is currently under comprehensive review. The renewal recommendations are due to the Appropriations Committee." He paused, checking his watch. Thursday morning. 3 days from now. Isabella felt like she was falling through the floor of the airplane. 3 days. The biggest contract renewal in her company's history, worth over $2 billion, was being decided in 3 days. And the man making that decision was the man she'd just tried to have arrested for being black in first class. "Sir," she started, her voice shaking. "Surely personal feelings won't interfere with business decisions. My company has an excellent track record." "Does it?" Marcus interrupted, his voice still quiet, but now carrying an edge that made everyone in the cabin lean forward. "Because from where I sit, your company's track record is concerning." He reached into his backpack and pulled out a tablet, military grade and encrypted. With a few taps, he pulled up a file and began reading. "Whitmore Digital Holdings Security Clearance Violations Fiscal Year 2024. Inadequate background checks on personnel, compromised data, protocols, cost overruns exceeding 40% on 3 separate projects, and..." He looked up at her, a concerning pattern of discrimination complaints from minority employees. Isabella's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. "Those complaints were dismissed," she managed to say. "They were settled," Marcus corrected. "There's a difference. And settling discrimination cases doesn't look good when the government is deciding whether to trust you with national security." The full weight of the disaster was starting to hit Isabella. It wasn't just that she'd made a scene on a plane. It wasn't just that she'd been caught being racist on camera. She had personally attacked the one man who could destroy her company with a single recommendation. "What happens if we don't get renewed?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. Marcus closed his tablet and looked at her with the same expression he might give to a bug he'd found in his hotel room. "Your company loses 80% of its revenue. Your stock becomes worthless. Your employees lose their jobs. And you personally face bankruptcy." He slipped the tablet back into his backpack. "But surely that's not your decision alone," Isabella said desperately. "There's a committee, right?" "Other people involved." Marcus stood up slowly, his full height now visible to everyone in the cabin. He wasn't a big man, but he carried himself with the kind of authority that made people step aside when he walked down a hallway. "Ms. Rodriguez-Whitmore," he said, "I am the chairman of that committee." The words hit Isabella like a physical blow. Chairman. The chairman of the committee that would decide her company's fate. The man she'd called a criminal, a drug dealer, a threat to airline security, was the single most important person in her professional universe. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "No, no, no, this isn't happening." But it was happening, and everyone was watching. Sophie's TikTok stream had been picked up by CNN and Fox News. Jake's Instagram Live was being embedded on news websites across the globe. #Flightgate was already trending on Twitter with the hashtag Commander Thompson right behind it. Elena, the flight attendant, finally remembered where she'd seen Marcus before. It was at a Veterans Appreciation event in Washington where he'd been giving a speech about service and sacrifice. He'd been in dress uniform, then covered in ribbons and medals, but his eyes were the same, kind but unwavering, patient but strong. Sir Elena said quietly, "I remember you now, from the Veterans Day ceremony in D.C. You spoke about integrity." Marcus nodded. "Thank you, Elena. And yes, I did speak about integrity, about how character matters more than rank, more than wealth, more than the clothes you wear or the seat you sit in." He looked directly at Isabella when he said this. I talked about how we judge the content of a person's character by how they treat people who can't do anything for them, people who they think are beneath them. Isabella was crying now, not tears of sadness, but of pure terror. $40 billion in government contracts, thousands of employees, her entire fortune, her entire identity, everything she was and everything she owned hung in the balance. "Please," she whispered. "I made a mistake. I was stressed, I was tired, I didn't mean—" "You didn't mean what Marcus asked. You didn't mean to call me a criminal. You didn't mean to tell the police I was armed and dangerous. You didn't mean to say I fit the profile of someone who would cause trouble." Each question was like a hammer blow. Isabella had no answer because there was no answer. She had meant every word and everyone knew it. "I can make this right," she said desperately. "Donations, charities, whatever you want. My company can do pro bono work for veteran organizations." Marcus shook his head slowly. "It's too late for that Ms. Rodriguez-Whitmore. You see, I wasn't on the fence about your contract renewal. I was actually leaning toward approval for the sake of your employees who depend on those jobs." He gestured around the cabin where dozens of phones were recording every word. "But leadership matters. Character matters. And in the last hour, you've shown me exactly what kind of leader you are. What kind of person you are." Isabella was sobbing now, her makeup running her perfectly styled hair disheveled. The other passengers were watching in stunned silence, witnessing the complete destruction of a human being in real time. "The committee meets tomorrow morning," Marcus said, his voice calm and final. "I'll be recommending immediate termination of all Whitmore Digital Holdings contracts effective immediately. National security requires partners we can trust, and trust is something you've just proven you'll never have." He sat back down and reopened his book, effectively dismissing her from existence. Isabella stood in the aisle, swaying slightly as the full magnitude of her destruction washed over her. Her company was finished. Her fortune was gone. Her name would be forever associated with this moment, this humiliation, this complete and utter defeat. And the plane hadn't even taken off yet. Captain Mitchell looked at the police officers who were still standing awkwardly in the cabin. "Officers, thank you for responding so quickly. As you can see, there's no security threat here. Just a very unfortunate misunderstanding." Sergeant Santos nodded. "Understood, Captain. Sir," he turned to Marcus, "thank you for your service. And ma'am," he looked at Isabella with disgust, "you might want to consider an apology. To everyone." But Isabella was beyond apologies. She was staring at her phone, watching her stock portfolio crash in real time as news of the incident spread across social media. Whitmore Digital Holdings was down 15% and falling fast as investors realized what was happening. "We need to take off," Captain Mitchell announced. "Mrs. Rodriguez-Whitmore, take your seat and remain silent for the duration of this flight, or I will have you removed and arrested for disrupting the safety of the aircraft." Isabella stumbled to her seat and slammed the door shut, but it was too late. The damage was done, the video was viral, and her world was ending at 35,000 feet. As the plane finally pushed back from the gate, Marcus Thompson returned to his book, unaware that he'd just become the most famous man on the internet. As Flight 847 climbed toward cruising altitude, the internet was exploding. Sophie Martinez's TikTok video had been viewed 2.3 million times in the first hour, with shares pouring in so fast her phone couldn't keep up with the notifications. The clip, Isabella pointing accusingly at Marcus while shouting about drug dealers and criminals, was being screen recorded, downloaded, and re-uploaded across every platform on Earth. Jake Rodriguez's Instagram live stream had peaked at 450,000 concurrent viewers before Instagram's servers briefly struggled to handle the load. The moment when Captain Mitchell saluted Marcus had been clipped and was already being remixed with everything from America the Beautiful to hip-hop beats. In her luxury suite, Isabella Rodriguez-Whitmore stared at her phone in horror as the hashtags mounted. Hashtag Flightgate was trending at #1 worldwide. Hashtag Commander Thompson was number 2. Hashtag Karma. At altitude was climbing fast, but it was the hashtag Whitmore digital done that made her blood run cold. The financial markets had noticed. Whitmore Digital Holdings was in free fall, down 28% and dropping as after-hours trading volumes exploded. Investment firms were issuing emergency sell recommendations. Business news networks were breaking into regular programming with breaking defense contractor CEO in racist airplane incident. Isabella's hands shook as she scrolled through Twitter. The top trending video had 8.7 million views and was titled "Rich Woman Calls Security on Pentagon Official, Instantly Regrets It." The comments were brutal. Imagine being so racist you accidentally destroy your own billion-dollar company. This woman makes millions off military contracts and treats a veteran like this. Cancel every contract now. The audacity. She really called a deputy director a drug dealer and thought she'd get away with it. Her face when she realized who he was. Priceless. Celebrity retweets were pouring in. Military veterans were sharing their own stories of discrimination. Civil rights leaders were calling for investigations. The story was spreading beyond social media into mainstream news, with CNN, Fox News, and BBC all preparing breaking news segments. Isabella tried calling her PR firm, but the call went straight to voicemail. She tried her lawyer, same thing. She tried her company's chief communications officer. His assistant said he was in emergency meetings and unable to take calls. Meanwhile, 3 rows ahead, Marcus Thompson was calmly reading his book, occasionally sipping his sparkling water. His phone was buzzing constantly with encrypted messages from Washington, but he ignored them all. Whatever crisis was happening in the intelligence community could wait. He was on vacation, and he planned to enjoy his book. Sophie Martinez was still streaming, though she'd switched to a more subdued tone. "Guys, I think we just witnessed history," she whispered to her phone. "Like this is going to be in textbooks someday. How one moment of racism destroyed an entire company." Elena, the flight attendant, kept glancing back at Isabella's closed suite door. She'd served thousands of passengers, but she'd never seen someone's life implode so completely and so publicly. There was almost something tragic about it. A woman so consumed by her own privilege that she couldn't see the cliff she was walking toward. Jake Rodriguez was fielding interview requests through his live stream comments. CNN wanted to talk to him when they landed. So did the Washington Post, the New York Times, and about a dozen international news outlets. The story was becoming global, with news sites in London, Paris, Tokyo, and Sydney all picking up the feed. But the real damage was happening in corporate boardrooms across America. Whitmore Digital Holdings Board of Directors had been called into an emergency session at 11 p.m. on a Tuesday night. The company's stock was approaching a 40% decline, and the phones were ringing non-stop with reporters, investors, and very angry government officials. As the Boeing 787 reached cruising altitude somewhere over the Atlantic, the dynamic in first class had shifted completely. What started as Isabella's domain, her kingdom of wealth and privilege, had become her prison. The other passengers weren't just avoiding her, they were actively disgusted by her presence. Marcus Thompson had become something of a folk hero without trying. Passengers from business and economy class were finding excuses to walk past first class just to get a glimpse of the man who'd handled Isabella's attack with such dignity. A few veterans on the plane had asked Elena to pass along their thanks for his service. Isabella, meanwhile, hadn't emerged from her suite in 2 hours. She was trapped behind her closed door with nothing but her phone and the worst internet connection of her life. The airplane Wi-Fi was slow, but it was fast enough to show her the complete destruction of everything she'd built. Her company's emergency board meeting had ended with a preliminary vote of no confidence. Her own board, people she'd hired, people who owed their positions to her, had decided she was too much of a liability to remain as CEO. The official announcement would come after the markets opened, but the decision was already made. The government contracts that formed the backbone of Whitmore Digital Holdings were being reviewed by emergency committees. Marcus Thompson's recommendation alone would have been enough to kill them, but now there was public pressure too. Senators were calling for investigations. Defense Department officials were distancing themselves from the company. The Pentagon was quietly moving to terminate every Whitmore contract immediately. Isabella tried to call her brother-in-law, the TSA official she'd mentioned to the police. His secretary informed her that he was no longer able to take her calls and that he'd requested she not contact him again. 20 years of family connection destroyed in a 2-minute phone call. She tried reaching out to other government contacts. People she'd played golf with, donated money to, entertained at expensive dinners. None of them would take her calls. In Washington, being associated with Isabella Rodriguez-Whitmore had become toxic overnight. The financial damage was spreading beyond just her company. The private equity firm that held a stake in Whitmore Digital was seeing their entire portfolio affected. The luxury brands she endorsed were quietly removing her from their marketing materials. The charity board she sat on were drafting statements distancing themselves from her. But perhaps the cruelest irony was happening in her own first-class cabin. The same space where she'd tried to flex her privilege was now documenting her downfall. Sophie Martinez was providing live updates to her followers. Jake Rodriguez was interviewing other passengers about what they'd witnessed, and Elena was being flooded with requests for official statements from the airline. "It's like watching someone commit professional suicide in real time," Sophie whispered to her camera. She literally destroyed herself trying to destroy someone else. Marcus Thompson, for his part, seemed completely unaffected by the chaos he'd unintentionally caused. He'd finished one book and moved on to another, a biography of Frederick Douglass that he'd been meaning to read for months. Occasionally he'd glance up when Isabella's muffled sobbing got loud enough to hear through her suite door, but mostly he just read and enjoyed the excellent service from a flight crew that now treated him like visiting royalty. Captain Mitchell made an announcement from the cockpit. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing some unusual circumstances today, but I want to assure all passengers that we have outstanding individuals traveling with us, and Atlantic Airways is honored to serve everyone aboard this flight." Everyone knew she was talking about Marcus, while Isabella Rodriguez-Whitmore hid in her first-class suite watching her empire crumble. The consequences of her actions were cascading through the corporate world like a financial tsunami. In Washington, D.C., Pentagon officials were working through the night to distance the Department of Defense from Whitmore Digital Holdings. The optics were devastating. A major defense contractor's CEO caught on video making racist attacks against a high-ranking intelligence official. Every contract, every clearance, every relationship was now toxic. Marcus Thompson's phone was buzzing constantly with secure messages from his team at the Defense Intelligence Agency, but he continued to ignore them. His deputy, Colonel Patricia Hayes, was fielding calls from senators' cabinet members and allied intelligence agencies. Everyone wanted to know what would happen to Whitmore Digital, and everyone wanted reassurance that their own contracts weren't at risk. The answers were simple. Whitmore Digital Holdings was finished. The company that had spent 15 years building relationships in Washington had destroyed them all in 15 minutes of racist rage at 35,000 feet. Isabella's stock holdings, which represented her entire fortune, had lost $1.2 billion in value since takeoff. The company she'd inherited from her husband was hemorrhaging money contracts and credibility at a rate that financial analysts were calling unprecedented. Her board of directors had already drafted her termination letter. The morals clause in her contract, ironically a clause she'd insisted on to control her employees' behavior, gave them the right to fire her immediately for conduct that brought disrepute to the company. The severance package she'd negotiated for herself was void if she was terminated for cause, which meant she'd leave with nothing but her legal bills. But the corporate consequences went beyond just Isabella's company. The entire defense contracting industry was being scrutinized. Other CEOs were frantically reviewing their own social media policies, conducting emergency diversity training and distancing themselves from any association with Whitmore Digital Holdings. Congress was taking notice, too. The House Armed Services Committee announced they would be conducting hearings on character and leadership standards for defense contractors. The Senate was threatening to pass new legislation requiring cultural competency training for all executives at companies holding government contracts. International allies were watching as well. NATO cybersecurity partnerships that Whitmore Digital had been part of were being restructured without them. Allied intelligence agencies were quietly asking whether other American defense contractors could be trusted if this was the caliber of leadership they employed. The ripple effects were hitting Isabella's personal finances, too. Her membership at exclusive country clubs was being reviewed. Her charitable foundation was losing donors. Her luxury properties, leveraged against her Whitmore stock, were now underwater assets that banks were preparing to seize. She'd tried calling her wealth management firm, but they'd already moved her account to their special situations team, the department that handled clients facing bankruptcy, divorce, or criminal charges. As Flight 847 began its descent into London Heathrow, Isabella Rodriguez-Whitmore faced a grim reality. The woman who'd boarded the plane as the CEO of a billion-dollar company was about to land as a global symbol of entitlement and racism. The scene at Heathrow was unprecedented. News vans from every major network lined the tarmac. British police were stationed at the gate, not for security, but to manage the media circus that would follow. Reporters from around the world had converged on Terminal 5, turning a routine flight arrival into an international incident. Captain Mitchell announced over the intercom, "Ladies and gentlemen, as we prepare for landing, I want to remind everyone that this aircraft is still under federal jurisdiction until we reach the gate. Any passenger who attempts to interfere with crew operations or harass fellow passengers will be arrested by British authorities." Everyone knew she was talking about Isabella. Marcus Thompson packed his simple backpack and prepared to deplane like any other passenger. He'd been contacted by diplomatic security and informed that the British government was providing a private exit to avoid the media circus, but he'd declined. He wasn't hiding from anything. He'd done nothing wrong. Isabella, meanwhile, was facing the end of her world. Her phone showed missed calls from every major news outlet, her lawyers, her accountants, and several federal agencies. The FBI had announced they were opening an investigation into whether her false police report constituted interference with a federal official. The IRS was reviewing her tax returns. The SEC was examining her stock trades for insider trading violations. As the plane touched down at Heathrow, Isabella's stock portfolio showed a total loss of 78% since takeoff. Whitmore Digital Holdings was worth less than the debt it owed. She was effectively bankrupt. The cabin crew prepared for arrival, but the mood was somber. Elena and the other flight attendants had been instructed to remain professional, but they couldn't hide their disgust for what they'd witnessed. Patricia Woods, the chief flight attendant, had filed a formal incident report that would become evidence in multiple investigations. Sophie Martinez was still streaming, though her tone had changed from excitement to something approaching grief. "Guys, I know we wanted to see justice, but watching someone destroy their entire life in real time is actually kind of heartbreaking. Like this could have all been avoided if she'd just been a decent human being." Jake Rodriguez was fielding interview requests from his seat scheduling appearances on every major network for the next week. His live stream had made him an accidental journalist, and news organizations were bidding for exclusive rights to his footage. As passengers began to deplane, Isabella remained in her seat. She couldn't face the cameras, the questions, the global humiliation that awaited her in the terminal. But she couldn't stay on the plane forever. Marcus Thompson stood up, shouldered his backpack, and walked calmly toward the exit. As he passed Isabella's closed suite, he paused for just a moment. "Ms. Rodriguez-Whitmore," he said quietly, his voice carrying through the door. "Character is destiny. I hope you remember that." He walked off the plane and into the terminal, where he was immediately surrounded by reporters. But instead of running or hiding, he stopped and faced them. Deputy Director Thompson. What's your response to this incident? Marcus looked directly into the cameras with the same calm dignity he'd shown throughout the entire ordeal. I believe character matters more than wealth, more than position, more than the color of your skin or the clothes you wear. Today, everyone got to see exactly what that means. He walked through the crowd and disappeared into a waiting car, leaving behind a global lesson in dignity, grace, and the power of quiet strength. Isabella Rodriguez-Whitmore was still sitting on the plane watching her world burn from 35,000 feet down to ground level. 3 months had passed since Flight 847 touched down at Heathrow, and the business world was still reeling from what became known as the Whitmore meltdown. Isabella Rodriguez-Whitmore's empire hadn't just collapsed. It had imploded so spectacularly that Harvard Business School was already developing a case study about it. Whitmore Digital Holdings was extinct. The board of directors had voted unanimously to terminate Isabella's position as CEO within 48 hours of the incident, citing the morals clause she'd ironically strengthened years earlier to control her employees' behavior. The company's stock, once valued at $180 per share, had been delisted from the NASDAQ after falling to $3.50 and failing to recover. The $2.8 billion in government contracts that formed the backbone of Whitmore Digital had been terminated immediately. Marcus Thompson's committee had fast-tracked their review, and the recommendation was unanimous: immediate termination for cause with no opportunity for appeal. The contracts were redistributed to competitors within a week, leaving Whitmore Digital with essentially no revenue stream. Isabella's personal fortune estimated at $1.4 billion before the flight had evaporated completely. Her Coral Gables mansion was in foreclosure. Her Hampton estate had been seized by creditors. Her art collection, including pieces by Monet and Picasso, was being auctioned to pay legal fees and outstanding debts. The cascade of lawsuits was staggering. Current and former employees filed discrimination suits armed with video evidence of Isabella's character. Government whistleblowers came forward with evidence of corner-cutting and compliance failures. Shareholders sued for breach of fiduciary duty. Even her country club had sued her for damages to their reputation. The corporate obituary was swift and brutal. 15,000 employees lost their jobs when Whitmore Digital's assets were liquidated. The Pentagon had blacklisted not just Isabella, but any company that hired her in any capacity. She'd become unemployable in the only industry she'd ever known. But the collapse went beyond just finances. Isabella's social circle, built over decades of wealth and influence, had vanished overnight. Friends stopped returning calls. Charity boards asked for her resignation. The exclusive restaurants where she'd held court for years quietly asked her not to return. Her brother-in-law at the TSA had taken early retirement to avoid the scandal. Her yacht club membership was revoked. Her personal assistant of 10 years had sold an exclusive interview to 60 Minutes, detailing Isabella's history of racist and classist behavior behind closed doors. The financial press was calling it the fastest destruction of wealth in corporate history. Fortune magazine featured Isabella on their cover with the headline, "How to Lose $2.8 billion in 45 Minutes." The Wall Street Journal ran a 5-part series on how personal character affects corporate value. But perhaps the most painful irony was that Marcus Thompson had tried to save her job. In a classified Pentagon briefing that later leaked, it was revealed that Thompson had actually been planning to recommend Whitmore Digital's contract renewal before the flight. The company's technical capabilities were sound, and the jobs were important to the economy. Isabella's racist outburst hadn't just revealed her true character. It had literally cost 15,000 people their livelihoods. While Isabella's world burned, Marcus Thompson was quietly revolutionizing how the government dealt with discrimination and bias in the contracting process. The incident on Flight 847 had given him a platform he'd never sought, and he was determined to use it constructively. 6 weeks after the flight, Thompson announced the Dignity Protocol, a comprehensive AI-powered monitoring network that would track discrimination complaints, leadership behavior, and corporate culture metrics for all major government contractors. The network would analyze everything from employee reviews to social media posts to legal settlements, creating a real-time assessment of each company's commitment to equality and inclusion. The network was developed in partnership with the major tech companies that had absorbed Whitmore Digital's former contracts. It used machine learning to identify patterns of discriminatory behavior before they became public scandals, potentially saving the government billions in contract disruptions. Elena Vasquez, the flight attendant who'd first recognized something familiar about Marcus, had been promoted to Vice President of Diversity and Inclusion at Atlantic Airways. Her story of standing up to racism while maintaining professionalism had made her a sought-after speaker at corporate conferences. The airline industry was implementing new bias prevention training based on her recommendations. Sophie Martinez had parlayed her viral video into a career as a travel equality advocate. Her TikTok following had grown to 12 million, and she used her platform to highlight discrimination in the travel industry. Airlines began reaching out to her for consultation on inclusive policies, and she'd launched a nonprofit that provided travel grants to minority students. Jake Rodriguez had become an accidental journalist with his live stream footage, serving as evidence in multiple federal investigations. News networks were bidding for his exclusive coverage rights, and he'd used his newfound fame to launch a digital platform focused on accountability journalism. His motto, "Sunlight is the best disinfectant." The incident had sparked broader conversations about privilege, accountability, and the power of social media to deliver instant justice. Universities were teaching courses on the Whitmore case, examining how corporate leadership, personal behavior, and public accountability intersect in the digital age. Congress had passed new legislation requiring character assessments for all senior executives at companies holding major government contracts. The Thompson standards, as they became known, required background checks, not just for security clearances, but for patterns of discriminatory behavior. International allies had adopted similar measures. The NATO cybersecurity protocols now included cultural competency requirements, ensuring that partner organizations shared democratic values of equality and inclusion. Marcus Thompson's life had changed in ways he never expected. The quiet intelligence official who preferred to work behind the scenes had become a global symbol of dignity under pressure. Speaking invitations poured in from universities, corporations, and government agencies around the world. But Thompson used his newfound prominence carefully. He established the Quiet Strength Foundation, providing scholarships for underserved students pursuing careers in public service. The foundation's motto, borrowed from Frederick Douglass, was simple: "Character is destiny." He'd been promoted to Director of Defense Intelligence, making him one of the most powerful people in the U.S. intelligence community. But those who worked with him said success hadn't changed him. He still flew commercial, still read paperback books, and still treated everyone from janitors to cabinet members with the same respect. Thompson had also become a sought-after mentor for young officers and intelligence professionals. His lesson was always the same: your character is your most valuable asset. Protect it like your life depends on it, because your life does depend on it. Isabella Rodriguez-Whitmore's transformation was far more painful, but ultimately more profound. Living in a modest apartment in London, she was forced to confront the reality of her actions and their consequences. Without her wealth, her staff, her corporate armor, she was just a woman who had to face what she'd become. The criminal charges had been dropped after she agreed to community service and sensitivity training. But the civil lawsuits would follow her for years, ensuring that any future earnings would go to compensating those she'd harmed. For the first time in her adult life, Isabella was working a regular job as a customer service representative for a small insurance company that hadn't recognized her name. The irony wasn't lost on her. She was now the person who got yelled at by entitled customers, giving her a perspective she'd never had when she was the one doing the yelling. The work was humbling, exhausting, and poorly paid. But it was also educational. Isabella began to understand what it felt like to be powerless, to be treated as disposable, to have your humanity ignored by people who considered themselves your betters. She'd started therapy, something her pride would never have allowed before. Dr. Sarah Chen, her therapist, was helping her understand the roots of her privilege, her racism, and her entitled behavior. It was painful work, but it was necessary. Isabella had also begun volunteering at a community center in East London, working with refugees and immigrants, people she would have once viewed with suspicion and contempt. The work was unpaid and often thankless, but it was slowly teaching her the value of service over self-importance. 1 year after Flight 847, Marcus Thompson was back at Heathrow Airport, but this time he was there for a NATO cybersecurity summit, not a personal vacation. He was walking through the same terminal where he'd been surrounded by reporters 12 months earlier, but now the attention had died down. He was once again just another passenger in comfortable clothes reading a book while waiting for his flight. He'd accomplished everything he'd set out to do in the aftermath of the Isabella incident. The Dignity Protocol was preventing discrimination throughout the defense contracting industry. Government partnerships were stronger because they were based on shared values, not just technical capabilities. And thousands of young people were entering public service with a clear understanding that character mattered more than credentials. As he sat in the departure lounge, Marcus noticed a familiar face across the terminal. Isabella Rodriguez-Whitmore was working at an information desk, helping confused travelers find their gates. She looked different. Older, tired, but somehow more human than she'd been in her corporate armor. Their eyes met across the crowded terminal. Isabella's face showed recognition, then shame, then something that might have been gratitude. She nodded slightly, not in greeting but in acknowledgement. An acknowledgement that her destruction had been her own doing and that somehow impossibly it had led to something better. Marcus nodded back. Not in forgiveness. What she'd done was unforgivable, but in recognition of the possibility of redemption through service. As his flight was called, Marcus gathered his things and walked toward the gate. Behind him, Isabella continued helping travelers, doing work that mattered, even if it wasn't glamorous serving others, even if it didn't serve her ego. The world had moved on from their 45-minute encounter on Flight 847, but the lessons remained. Character was indeed destiny. Dignity could triumph over privilege. And sometimes the most powerful response to hatred wasn't anger, but the quiet strength to remain true to your principles even when others abandon theirs. As Marcus boarded his flight back to Washington, he opened his book, a new biography of Harriet Tubman, and smiled slightly. He was still just a man trying to serve his country, still preferring to work behind the scenes, still believing that the best victory was one where everyone had a chance to become better than they were before. The plane pushed back from the gate, carrying him toward whatever challenges awaited. But he carried with him the knowledge that when tested, when faced with hatred and privilege, and the worst impulses of human nature, quiet dignity would always find a way to prevail. 2 years have passed since Flight 847 became the most watched airplane incident in Internet history, and the ripple effects continue to reshape lives and industries around the world. Marcus Thompson now serves as Director of Defense Intelligence, overseeing cybersecurity operations that protect American interests across 6 continents. But his colleagues say the promotion hasn't changed him. He still flies commercial, still reads paperback books, and still treats the Pentagon cafeteria staff with the same respect he shows cabinet members. The Quiet Strength Foundation has awarded scholarships to over 3,000 students, many of whom are now serving in government, military, and civil rights organizations. When asked about his legacy, Thompson simply says, "Character is destiny. Everything else is just details." Isabella Rodriguez-Whitmore lives quietly in East London, working as a community outreach coordinator for a refugee assistance program. The woman who once demanded to speak to managers now spends her days helping asylum seekers navigate British bureaucracy. She earns less in a year than she once spent on a single handbag, but those who work with her say she's found something she never had when she was wealthy: purpose. She's requested no interviews and makes no public statements about her past, preferring to let her current actions speak for themselves. Elena Vasquez has become the most recognized flight attendant in the world, using her platform to train airline staff in bias recognition and passenger advocacy. Atlantic Airways discrimination complaints have dropped 78% since implementing her training protocols, and other airlines are adopting her methods worldwide. She's been invited to speak at the United Nations about dignity in the workplace. Sophie Martinez transformed her viral TikTok moment into a career as a travel equality advocate, with her platform reaching 18 million followers. Her nonprofit Seats for All has documented and helped resolve hundreds of discrimination cases in the travel industry. Airlines now consult with her organization before implementing new policies, knowing that her endorsement can make or break their public image. Jake Rodriguez parlayed his live stream into a multimedia company focused on accountability journalism. His motto, "Sunlight is the best disinfectant," has become a rallying cry for citizen journalists worldwide. His documentation of the Flight 847 incident is now studied in journalism schools as an example of how social media can serve the public good. The changes sparked by 45 Minutes on Flight 847 have transformed entire industries. The Dignity Protocol, developed by Marcus Thompson, is now used by governments in 23 countries to evaluate contractor relationships. Artificial intelligence monitors corporate behavior in real time, identifying patterns of discrimination before they explode into public scandals. Airlines have revolutionized their training programs, with bias prevention now a required component of crew certification. The Flight 847 protocols mandate that any passenger complaint based on race, religion, or appearance must be reviewed by senior staff before action is taken. First-class lounges display placards reminding travelers that dignity and respect are our highest priorities. The incident accelerated conversations about privilege and accountability in corporate America. Business schools now teach the Whitmore case as an example of how personal character affects corporate value. The Harvard Business Review called it the most expensive racist tantrum in history, calculating that Isabella's actions cost the economy over $3 billion in disrupted contracts, legal fees, and lost productivity. Technology companies have developed new tools for real-time bias detection in hiring, promotion, and customer service decisions. The algorithms first tested on defense contractors are now being used by Fortune 500 companies to prevent discrimination before it occurs. Congress passed the Thompson standards requiring character assessments for executives at companies holding major government contracts. The legislation has been copied by the European Union, Canada, and Australia, creating a global standard for ethical leadership in government contracting. Perhaps most importantly, the incident demonstrated the power of quiet dignity in the face of hatred. Marcus Thompson's calm response to Isabella's attack has been studied by conflict resolution experts, civil rights leaders, and law enforcement agencies. His example proves that the most powerful response to aggression isn't more aggression, but unwavering commitment to principle. If you've made it this far, you've witnessed more than just a story about an airplane incident. You've seen how character shapes destiny, how dignity defeats privilege, and how one moment of choice can change everything. The lesson of Flight 847 isn't just about racism or wealth or corporate power. It's about who we choose to be when we think no one is watching, and what happens when everyone suddenly is. Marcus Thompson could have responded to Isabella's attack with anger, with his own display of power, with the kind of public humiliation that social media loves. Instead, he chose quiet strength, and that choice changed laws, saved careers, and showed the world what real leadership looks like. Isabella Rodriguez-Whitmore thought her wealth and status made her immune to consequences. She learned too late that character matters more than cash, and that privilege without humanity is just borrowed time waiting to be called in. But this story isn't over. Every day in airports and boardrooms and classrooms around the world, people face the same choice Marcus and Isabella faced. How will you treat someone when you think you have power over them? How will you respond when your character is tested? Share your own stories in the comments below. Have you witnessed bias? Have you spoken up when you saw injustice? Have you been the Marcus Thompson in a difficult situation? Or have you learned from being the Isabella? Subscribe to this channel for more stories of justice, accountability, and the power of ordinary people doing extraordinary things. Hit the notification bell, because these stories matter now more than ever. And remember, in a world of surveillance and social media, character isn't just destiny, it's survival. Every interaction is potentially public, every choice potentially permanent, every moment a chance to show who you really are. The next time you're in seat 1A, or standing in line or dealing with someone you think is beneath you, remember Flight 847. Remember that the person you're looking at might be the one person who can change your life forever. Choose dignity, choose respect, choose character, because in the end, that's all that really matters.